a wonderful evening we have, and what a great crowd. So thank you for being here, and welcome to UMKC. My name is Barb Bickelmeyer. I serve as the interim chancellor and provost at this institution, and I'm glad you're able to join us for our annual Social Justice Book and Lecture Series. Tonight's program, featuring national reporter Wesley Lowery of the Washington Post, will shed light on the critical issue of social justice in the context of current events. This is one of several lecture series events brought to you by UMKC's Division of Diversity and Inclusion. The objectives of this series are to foster a sense of community on our campus through shared literature and relevant dialogue, to prompt participants to think critically about the historical context of social justice issues, to focus on current social justice challenges and the interdisciplinary thought and leadership skills necessary to solving these challenges, and to provide a platform for further reflection, dialogue, and action within our campus and in the greater community through related coursework, gatherings, and exposure to local, regional, and national social justice projects and initiatives. Diversity and inclusion is vital to our mission at UMKC. We were founded in part for this very reason. In alignment with Goal 5 of our university strategic plan, to embrace diversity and the Division of Diversity and Inclusion aims to foster inclusive educational opportunities and an equitable community environment for all students, faculty, staff, and our community stakeholders. It's important to us to host open dialogues and lecture series events on our campus in order to learn to share our thoughts and ideas. As an urban serving research university and as a driver of excellence in teaching and learning, UMKC embraces a broad spectrum of diversity. We want all people to know that they are welcome here. I encourage each of us tonight to listen with open hearts and open minds, to learn and to foster new ideas for making social justice a priority through an empathetic perspective and experience. So thank you again for being here. I'd like to introduce Susan Wilson, our Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UMKC. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I thank each and every one of you for coming tonight, because it really affirms the fact that the lectures that we provide are really hitting hot issues and a nerve in the community. This lecture would not be all that it could be without the support of our community, so we have a few folks we want to thank. We really would like to thank our partners, Shook, Hardy, and Bacon, tonight represented by Gadir Garcia, for co-sponsoring this lecture. We really value that partnership. We're also very grateful to our campus and community partners, and want to especially recognize the UMKC libraries for hosting a book discussion on Wesley Lowery's book, They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. Course instructors, we really thank them for including the book in their course curriculum, because this is a common read program, and the Social Book Lecture Selection Committee, who supported this lecture, and all the students here who come tonight to hear our presentation. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge someone in our audience who's been a fighter for social justice in our community, particularly around community and police relationships. I remember when I first came to Kansas City years ago, I was a volunteer for Ad Hoc Group Against Crime. So give Alvin Brooks a hand. Because he's been a gunfighter for justice in this community for many years. All right. The information and perspectives exchanged during the discussions in our classes and meetings and at the library have been very helpful, and I hope that that continues. Tonight, we're providing a platform for further reflection, dialogue, and action within our campus and community. But before we bring on tonight's speaker, a few housekeeping matters. Please take the time right now to silence your cell phones. Even though I've heard some good beats that some of you have on your phone. We'd also like you to give us feedback after tonight's lecture. Believe it or not, we really listen to your feedback and get ideas about future speakers. So there is a survey on your chair, and please make sure you give it to a staff member. And come on in, there's seats all over here. Come on in, don't be shy. We will have a brief Q&A section at the conclusion of this lecture. Microphones are located on both sides of the aisle, but we really ask that you keep your questions brief. We don't want a soliloquy necessarily, because we want to give everyone time to get their question asked. At 7 p.m., we'll start a book sale, and we'll form a line just left of the stage here where books will be available for sale. Please keep in mind we want to make sure everybody has a chance to get a signature tonight, because we're concluding our gathering promptly at 7:45. So please make sure when you get your book signed, you're not holding up the line, taking too many pictures and things like that. We love you, though. So now that those things have been covered, we want to give a warm welcome to a national thought leader who will challenge us to face racial injustices within our university system, city, state, and nation. Wesley Lowery wrote the book that is our common read for this lecture, They Can't Kill Us All, as I referenced earlier. And it's a very deeply researched book that brings alive the quest for justice in the deaths of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Freddie Gray, offering both unparalleled insight into the reality of police violence in America and a very intimate, moving portrait of those working to end it. Right now, we'd like to take a brief moment of silence to reflect on the injustices and the losses of life that are mentioned both in the book and those that we see on the news every day. Thank you. Wesley Lowery is a national reporter for the Washington Post who covers law enforcement, justice, race, and politics. He was the paper's lead reporter in Ferguson, Missouri, covering the Black Lives Matter protest movement, and was a member of the team awarded the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for the Post's coverage of police shootings. His reporting previously appeared in the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And most excitingly, he's here with us tonight. So please join me in giving a loud and raucous welcome to author and Pulitzer Prize winner, Wesley Lowery.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for having me tonight. This is my first time in Kansas City, and it's been a fun and great trip already. You all have been really kind, and I'm really excited to chat with you all and get to know you a little bit more as well throughout the course of the night. And so what I typically do when I give talks, specifically book talks, is I kind of walk through a little bit of who I am, about how I ended up covering what I cover, and some of the work that myself and my colleagues at the Washington Post have done over the last few years. And then I shut up and we do questions and whatnot, which is usually the fun part. And so I will get to that point sooner rather than later, so that at least I don't have to hear my voice anymore and we can hear some of your voices as well. As the very kind introduction said, I am a national correspondent for the Washington Post. I've been doing this job for about almost four years now. Prior to that, I covered politics. I covered Congress for the Washington Post, and before that, local politics for the Boston Globe and for the LA Times. And so that was always what I wanted to do. I wanted to cover politics. I wanted to cover presidential elections. I remember watching all of the coverage of 2008 and 2012 and thinking that's what I wanted to do with my career. And specifically, I'd structured a lot of my career so that I could go on the presidential trail in 2016. That was my long-term goal. I was convinced that, that was going to be an election, that was going to be this kind of war of ideas and this kind of high quality, meeting of the minds, very substantive. You guys can laugh at that. It's fine. That'll be the only political thing I say all night, don't worry. Although I ended up spending 2016 covering something very different. I remember, as I said, I was I was working for the I was working for the Washington Post. I was on our congressional team. They had hired me in early 2014 to come down and cover Congress, and they told me essentially, if you show up and you do a good job, we'll get you on the presidential trail in a year or two. And so, so you should come cover Congress for us. Now, at the time, I didn't really know how Congress worked, or if it worked, or what it meant, or how it operated. I didn't, I bought a bunch of suits that didn't really fit me very well because you have to be dressed up when you go cover Congress, and I showed up trying to figure out how this worked, and that was my job for about a year. Which I really enjoyed. And when I took that job, one of my colleagues in Boston told me he used to work in D.C., and he said, look, you go to work in a museum every single day. And I did love that about it. Every day I was in the Capitol building. That painting on the wall was not just some painting. The French sent that to us in 1800. It's part of some treaty, right? That was in this space where I really got to see how the government was made and how it worked and didn't work every single day. And that was really valuable. But at the heart of some of the work I've done has always been an interest in issues of justice and issues of race. I had covered in Boston and Los Angeles. I had done both political reporting but also metro reporting. I'd been to a lot of crime scenes. I'd been to scenes of officer-involved shootings. I'd written about disparities in traffic stops. I had an interest in some of these issues. And in fact, some of the big stories I had done in my previous jobs were stories of officer-involved shootings. But I didn't intend or think that I'd end up in Ferguson, Missouri. In August 2014, I was in Michigan covering a Senate race. It was the midterm elections, and at the time there was this big question of what would happen to the Senate. Would the Democrats hold on to it? Would it flip? Would they, what was going to happen? And so I was covering a primary race in Michigan, and I no longer can remember. I say this in every talk, and every time I think I should look this up afterwards. I have no idea even who the candidates were, who was running anymore. But I was with a candidate for about a week throughout the state of Michigan, going to their campaign stops, interviewing voters, that type of work. And I remember flipping my phone open. I was staying with my grandparents. They live in Detroit. And so I was staying with them, and it was a Saturday night. I had finished my reporting for the day, and I sat down to have dinner with my grandparents. And my grandparents are fiddling around. My grandma's yelling at my grandpa to go get the good china from downstairs because their grandson's here, and we can't use this. Grandparents were being grandparents. And so as I'm sitting there, and so as I'm sitting there, I open Instagram. Now, this is a Saturday afternoon, and this will be a different response probably from the teachers and professors than from the students here, but I don't know what your guys' Instagram accounts look like on a Saturday afternoon. For me, it's usually a mixture of two things. The first is that there are a ton of pictures evidencing the Friday night that my friends had, right? And so there'll be photos from parties and from clubs and bars or from sporting events, but also because I'm friends with so many reporters, a lot of times it will be photos from the story that my friend who's a weekend anchor is covering in whatever market they work in or that type of thing. And so on that day, between all the party pictures, there was a series of photos and videos from my friend Brittany Noble. Now, Brittany was a reporter in St. Louis. She was a weekend reporter for the CBS affiliate there. And she happened to live in this suburb called Ferguson. And on August 9th, she was not supposed to be working. She had the Saturday off because she was engaged, and it was going to be her engagement photo shoot, right? And so Brittany is with her fiancé, Mike, and they are off in some scenic location up against a waterfall or with some rocks, or how those photo shoots go. And she starts getting calls and text messages from sources of hers. She's pretty well connected in the community. And she starts hearing from people who say, "You live in Ferguson, don't you?" That's the suburb she lived in. "We heard there was an officer-involved shooting. There was a police shooting, something about a body still being in the street. Do you know what's going on?" And so she's supposed to be smiling and posing and kissing and stuff, and she's looking at her phone, trying to figure out what's going on. So she calls into the office and says, "Hey, guys, do we have anyone in Ferguson? I heard there was an officer-involved shooting. There was, something's going on. People seem upset." And the station said to her, "Well, it's a Saturday. We're kind of short-staffed. We'll see if we can get someone out there in a few hours and figure out what happened. We'll see." Well, this really bothered Brittany. She couldn't put this down. She, like me, knows when an important story is happening and doesn't like being told not to go pursue it. And so Brittany turns to her fiance and then turns to the photographer and then asks to borrow the car keys and drives to Canfield Drive, where Michael Brown had been killed, leaving her fiance and the waterfall and the photographer behind. And Mike, her now husband, was a very good sport about that then and remains a good sport about it now that I tease him at all of these talks. And as Brittany gets there, she encounters what are the early moments in what would become a months-long and then eventually years-long story here in Ferguson. There had been a police shooting. A young man named Michael Brown had been shot and killed after an interaction with an officer named Darren Wilson. Well, at the time, no one knew either of their names and had no clue what might have happened in this interaction. What people did know was that this teenager, Big Mike, who people knew from the neighborhood, was lying in the street, and it had been an hour, then it had been 2, and then it had been 3. They saw as family members started showing up, asking, wait, is that Mike on the ground? What's going on? Why isn't he covered up? Why isn't he in an ambulance? What's happening? They saw as the police of the suburban department quickly became frustrated and flustered, and became demanding that people move back, and they brought dogs, and they started cordoning off areas. And very soon, what had been a small gathering of angry residents turned into a very large gathering of angry residents. At the core of their frustrations, this question of who killed Mike Brown and why is he still on the ground? 1 hour became 2, became 3, became 4.5. It got to the nighttime, at which point there was these kind of physical angry clashes between police and demonstrators. So I'm following all this in Michigan still on my phone. I'm watching these videos and these posts. At the time, 2014 doesn't feel like that long ago, but actually in our social media, a lot has changed. Back in 2014, there was almost no way to post. You couldn't post live video almost at all to social media, and it was very hard even to post video clips. You could upload something to YouTube and then use the link. Vine existed at the time. You could post to Instagram video, but those links don't work on Twitter and other places. And so there were these kind of confusing mishmatches. There would be these 6-second Vine clips, and then there'd be Instagram links, and that was basically how people were getting information out. And I'm watching as Brittany is doing interviews on Instagram. I'm watching these videos. I'm watching these posts of the demonstrations and of the signs people are making. Lucas Head, Michael Brown's stepfather, makes a cardboard sign that says, the Ferguson police killed by unarmed son tonight. And I see that on Brittany's Instagram feed. And I'm just watching this story play out. And even then, it felt like maybe there was something different here. So we fast forward a few days. I finish my trip in Michigan. I get back to Washington and go into the office on Monday morning. And it's now been 2 or 3 days since the shooting, and things have not cooled in Ferguson, Missouri. There was another clash between demonstrators and police the night for each of the last 2 nights. And in fact, on Sunday night, the gas station, the Quick Trip gas station, was burned down. And so as I got in the office, I knew that, at the Post, we didn't have a very robust weekend staff at the time. We hadn't really covered this yet. And so I knew coming in, we're going to have to write something about this. We're going to have to do something. So I stopped by and saw my colleague, Mark, who runs our national desk. And I said, what are you doing on this Missouri thing? Do you need any help? How can I help out? Again, I covered Congress, and so the thought was I would call maybe the Missouri congressional delegation, see if they had any information. Maybe I'd call the Department of Justice and see, if they're going to launch something that would be a very Washington Post type story. The feds coming into this type of thing. And as we're having this conversation, this back and forth about how I might be helpful to him, another editor walked by and said, hey, could you just get on an airplane? Could you just go to Missouri? We should get somebody there. We should figure out what's happening. You just got back from a trip. You got a bag packed, right? Can you go? And so I wasn't the happiest about the suggestion. I had taken a red eye back that morning. Monday, when you cover Congress, Monday is a down day for you because the secret to Congress is they only work Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And Friday is a travel day back to the district, and Monday is a travel day back to D.C. So Monday was my favorite day in the office when I covered Congress. But I thought, you know what? I'll go. I'll get on the plane. It'll be a quick 3-day trip. I'll maybe cover the news of the day tonight and then write some smart writerly thing for the weekend and be in and out of this. This will be a quick story. I've covered police shootings before. I've done some parachute reporting before where I drop in. This will be all right. And so I remember at the time I texted my friends, my best friends were all in this group text so we can find out what sports bar we're watching the game in on each given night. And I said, hey, I'm going to be out of town for a few days. I'm going to miss you guys at soccer, but I'll be back by Friday. I'll see you guys then. And I got on the next plane to St. Louis. So this was August 11th. And I land in St. Louis, and the first place I go is to the press conference, the first press conference being held by Michael Brown's family. We now know the name of Michael Brown, who'd been killed. And I'd been to a lot of press conferences like that before. The scenes felt familiar. There was a grieving family walking in with T-shirts they had just made with their dead son's face on them. In came Benjamin Crump, the civil rights attorney who'd been hired, and I knew him a little bit from the Trayvon Martin case and from other cases. And they began talking. They began talking about who Michael was. They began talking about the questions they still had. At this point, there was almost no information that had been released about the scenario of the shooting, about what happened, or at the time what the name of the officer was. And they began talking about what they wanted to know. And then Crump began talking, and he talked about how this wasn't an isolated incident, how this was linked to so many other cases, so many other shootings. And he talked about a list of other names, and that list back in August 2014 was different than the list we might have used today, but it was a list nonetheless. And so I get up and I leave the press conference with a notebook full of quotes and interviews. I talked to a few of his family members, but I still, for whatever reason, it felt similar. I wasn't sure yet what was going to make this different than the other police shootings I'd covered. So my next stop was at another church in St. Louis. The NAACP had called a meeting, a community meeting at a forum that evening. They had come in from out of town. They were very concerned about how upset the community was about what was going on. And so they called this meeting. So I get in the car and I drive across the street, drive across town to this meeting. And now, one thing about me is I'm not the best at logistics, which is not the best trait for someone who travels for their job every week. And so as I pull up to this church, I see what it must be 100 people who are out in the parking lot. And so I immediately think, oh, well, there was a time zone change. I'm either an hour late or an hour early, right? Why would all these people be outside? Either I have missed the event completely and these are the stragglers, or the doors aren't even open yet, and which would be a great problem, right? And so I get out of the car, grab my notebook, and I think, all right, well, at the very least, there are still people here. I can interview them. I can get some information. But as I get to the front of the church, the doors of the church, and I'm asking, hey, what's going on? They say, oh, no. The meeting is just starting, but we're at capacity. There are already 500 people in the church. These 100 people decided they weren't going to leave until the meeting is over, and they want to hear what was said inside. They're going to stand outside. They're going to wait till it's over, and then folks can come outside and tell them what happened. Now, this was the first indication to me that this story was different. And I'd covered a lot of community meetings in Boston and in Los Angeles, and very often I'd been one of 2 or 3 people in these meetings. And here, in August, in Missouri, it was 100.5 degrees, and here were 150 people deciding they were going to stand on this asphalt and they were going to wait for an hour so they could find out any information they could about that boy who was killed a few days ago. It spoke to how deeply a community had responded to what they saw as a clear injustice in their streets. So I get inside, I listen to part of this meeting, I come back outside, I'm interviewing folks, and then I start looking for someone I talked to earlier. Now, when I flew out to Ferguson, I started to ask folks, both on social media and in my own life, who do you know in St. Louis? Right? I posted on Facebook, hey, I'm going to Ferguson, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Anyone who knows anyone, put me in touch. Reporters do this very often, especially when we're going to some place we don't know, figuring out who we should be talking to, where we can get information. And on Twitter, dozens of people were pointing me to this same person, this girl, Janetta Elsie. They said, you have to talk to her, you've got to talk to Netta, she knows everything, she seems like she's everywhere. Now, Janetta, like Brittany, was a day one Ferguson person. She'd gotten there within the first few hours of Michael Brown being killed. Now, Janetta had been on her couch, actually at her grandmother's couch as well, only hers grandmother's in St. Louis, when she got a message from someone who said, hey, don't you live near St. Louis? There's this police shooting people on the internet are talking about. Now, what her friend didn't know at the time was that Janetta had a friend who had been killed by the police just several months earlier, Stefan Averyhart. And when that had happened, when that shooting happened, Janetta watched as one of her best friends, someone she loved and cared about, who'd always been very sweet to her. She read all of the media coverage because she was looking for any additional information. She wanted to know what happened. But what that meant was that she was interacting with a lot of descriptions that really hurt her. She saw, as one of the local stations described him as a felon when he was not. She was reading all of the internet comments about how this so-and-so deserved it, and good for him, and we're better off that this person's not here. And she was internalizing all of this, and she was thinking, torturing herself, wait, this is what my neighbors and my friends and the people, that guy from the grocery store, think about my friend who's been killed. that the world's better off that he's not here, that it's a good thing that this shooting had happened, this shooting that we still don't really know anything about. And so as Janetta sat there that day on her couch watching all of these updates from the local media, she had this feeling and this realization that, she didn't want to let what happened to Stefan happen to this young man, Michael. That she thought, well, if I go out there, I can take pictures of everything, I can tweet about everything, and then they can't lie, they can't make it up, they can't say, if I can document this myself, then I can hold the media accountable for what they're doing. It was interesting because we forget in the stories, 3 years later, sometimes we forget that so much of the initial social media conversation was media critique. It was frustration of local residents and national folks as well with how this story and others like it were being covered. And it really propelled a lot of the national conversation. It's interesting because this is the moment we live in right now in the United States. We used to have what I think of as kind of the ivory tower media theory, where people like me would, with our notebooks and fedora hats back then, would sit in our ivory tower and we would dictate to the population what was the news or was not the news. If something happened in your community, whether it was a police shooting or an event, a campus speaker, you could send a note to the newspaper and say, this thing has happened or is happening, you should cover it. And then you would sit and wait and wonder if the newspaper was going to show up and cover it, wonder if the television was going to show up and cover it. In many ways, the media organizations contained all of the power because unless we decided something was news, it was not the news. Social media and cell phones have changed that completely. It completely altered that dynamic, and have altered it in multiple ways. The first is that people now have publishing power themselves. If something happens in a room in which you are in, on a street where you are, within seconds, you can publish that information to everyone. People can immediately see what you are seeing. And if it's compelling, many more people will see it. Beyond that, it also allows readers to give direct and immediate feedback to not only news organizations by and large, but individual reporters. If every one of my colleagues on my beat is at an event and I'm not, I'll start getting tweets about, why aren't you here? We saw so-and-so from the Times is here and so-and-so from the Journal's here. That there's a capacity for readers to reach us directly in a way that they perhaps could not before. I mean, in the past, you could call the newspaper and maybe get a hold of someone, or you could write me a letter, a physical letter, or an email, and maybe I would get it eventually in a few days. But now, within seconds, someone right now could send something to me and I could see it in moments. It also, like I said, allows the populace, allows people to produce their own accounts, their own news. A story, I think very often about, why does Ferguson become a national story? Why does someone named Michael Brown, how many Michael Browns are there in the United States of America? How does he become a household name? Especially given how often these types of shootings happen. And one of the reasons, it was not because the media got there quickly, but it was because the residents were there and they were producing these dispatches in real time, almost immediately. We were seeing images, we were seeing interviews, we were seeing reaction. And that was then what brought the cameras and the reporters. So Netta had been one of those first day people. She'd been there since the very beginning. And so I told her, I started messaging with her because she was tweeting, media criticism and photos from the protest. And so I sent her a message and I said, hey, name's Wesley, I'm a reporter of the Washington Post, and I want to reach out because I'm getting on a plane to go to Ferguson, and I see a lot of your tweets have been like media criticism and frustration. I want to make sure we cover this story the right way. Can we meet up when I get there? She goes, of course. Here's my phone number. I'm going to be at this NAACP thing later today. Maybe meet me at that. We can figure this out. So I'm thinking, awesome. I've got a source. It's going to be good. We're going to figure this out. So moments later, I still tease her about this. Janetta starts tweeting. So we've been having this private message conversation. She goes, now a Washington Post reporter has come in to tell the story the right way. Can you believe this, guys? And I'm like, Janetta, I can see your tweets. Like, I follow you. And so here I am at this NAACP meeting, and I told her in these messages that I was going to be the light-skinned guy in an orange sweater. I was wearing a sweater. It was way too hot to be wearing a sweater. And I was like, I'm going to be the light-skinned guy in an orange sweater. I'll come find you. Let's talk. We'll figure this out. And the only thing you need to know about Janetta, so I get up to Janetta, And I say, hey, I'm Wesley from the Washington Post. We were messaging. And she looks at me and goes, you didn't tell me you were going to be this light-skinned. I was like, I can't win with you, can I, Jenna? And so I still tease her about that. So we start talking. I'm like, all right, what's the plan for the rest of the day? Are there going to be demonstrations? What exactly happened last night? Were you outside? I'm trying to just get some information. And finally I say, look, can we go in? We're in the city still. We're in St. Louis. Like, let's go out to the burbs. Let's go to Ferguson. I want to see where everything happened. I want to see where the shooting was. I want to see where the protests have been. I want to see what damage was done, how many stores were, I want to see it. So we get in the car, in the rental car, and I'm kind of speeding through these side streets, and she's trying to warn me. She's like, the police here are crazy. Stop speeding. I'm like, oh, it'll be fine. And so I'm whipping through these streets, and we get to Ferguson, where there, at the time, is a clash between some demonstrators and the police. In Ferguson, the main stretch where these protests existed was on the street called West Florissant, which is about a 4-lane highway with strip malls on either side and businesses. And most of the demonstrations kind of looped up and down West Florissant and some of the residential side streets that intersect it, including Canfield Drive, where the shooting happened. And so we're getting to Canfield and some of these other streets, and I'm interviewing residents, I'm talking to them. And I remember in that first night, doing these interviews, and I'm asking questions that now almost feel and sound naive as I recount them. Like, hey, I'm Wesley with the Washington Post. What's the relationship between the police and the black community like here? Or what do you think justice looks like in this case? What did you hear that happened? And I'm asking folks these kind of very elementary questions, trying to figure out where I am and what the dynamics are here. And what I was receiving in response, even on that first night, I'll never forget, were anecdotes and stories that were frankly horrifying. I was hearing stories about people held in jail for several nights because of unpaid traffic tickets, and people with how everyone had arrest warrants in a family, and they were all from tickets, about folks who'd called 911 for medical attention, and instead police had shown up and gotten into altercations with people. And I remember, as I'm writing all these things down, thinking to myself, I'm never going to be able to sustain all this. I'm never going to be able to use any of these stories. How am I going to prove that this guy, Edward, what he just told me, that it's true? How am I going to get it to a reportable place? That I believed, to some extent, their stories, but I just wasn't sure, and I didn't know how I was going to be able to use it. So I'm doing all these interviews, and eventually we begin getting tear gassed. At the time, the clash was essentially police who were yelling at a group of teenagers to disperse and get out of here. You guys have to leave. And the teenagers were basically saying, well, we live here. Where would you like us to go? You guys should go away. And so there's this yelling match back and forth. Go home. We are home. You guys go home. Right? And eventually tear gas begins, and and that was the first night they'd used tear gas in Ferguson, and it becomes an all-night ordeal of kind of covering the story and trying to figure out what's going on. And that was a moment where, I'd been in some kind of hairy situations before, but I had never been tear gassed in a suburb before, and that was kind of the moment when I realized that, this definitely was going to continue to be a thing. Now, like I said, we'll circle back on those stories I first got in my notebook, but as the days developed, as we went from day 1 to day 30, I thought I'd be there for three days. I ended up in Ferguson for more or less for 3 months, between August and the beginning of December. And as the story developed, each day felt a little bit the same. I'd go out and I'd interview residents and demonstrators and protesters and civil rights figures. And what we would hear time and time again was that this is a crisis, that unarmed black men are being executed in the streets every day with impunity. No one's being held accountable, and it has to stop. And so being a good newspaper reporter, I would call the police. I'd say, hey, so all the people think you're executing unarmed black men in the streets every day. You guys got a comment? Like, what's up? And the police would say, whoa. We are definitely not killing unarmed black people in the streets every day. Don't you know that most police officers never even pull their guns? And when we do, we definitely don't shoot people. And when we shoot people, they're definitely not unarmed black people. And when they are, they deserved it anyway, so we don't know what you're talking about. And so I would write up their quotes. And we would write this story, right? Jim Johnson, 42, of Ferguson, says this is a crisis. Police union said, definitely not. And as we wrote these stories, the editors and I would have these conversations about how it felt very unresolved, right? There was a truth buried in this disagreement, and wasn't it our job to get at that truth? Either the police are executing unarmed black people in the streets every day, or the police are never killing anybody, right? Both of those things could not be true. So which one was it? So we started chasing that question. We called the Ferguson police and the St. Louis County police and said, hey, how many unarmed black people did you kill this year? And they did not respond to our question. And so we called the Missouri Secretary of State and Attorney General's office. And we said, look, you guys must have statistics on like unarmed black people getting killed by the police. It seemed so naive even how we structured the question, right? Like, how many unarmed black people got killed in Missouri last year? It wasn't how many people got killed. And they said, well, we don't have any information for you. And so we are the Washington Post, and so we got all Washington Postian about it. And we're like, all right, let's go call Eric Holder. He's going to know how many unarmed black people get killed by the police every year. He's going to have a statewide breakdown somewhere. And so we march over to DOJ and say, we want to know how many unarmed black people got killed. So they call us back, and they say, look, we actually do have some numbers about police shootings and how often they happen. But they are definitely not accurate. And so if you use these numbers, we want you to quote us saying that we told you not to use these numbers. I said, oh, well, maybe there's something here. So at the time, their number, at the time, the Department of Justice, the arrest-related death report number, they had never, the federal government had never recorded any higher number than 463 fatal shootings in a year. That was the high water mark. The police had killed 463 people in a year, was the most ever. But what they told us, what the Department of Justice told us and other criminologists began telling us, was that the issue with this number was that, like most criminal justice data, it was a voluntary self-report. Police departments, the 18 to 19,000 police departments in the United States of America, we do not know the exact number of police departments, which tells you where the rest of this is going. We don't even know how many departments there are. Each year, the Department of Justice reaches out. They send in a letter, an email, and they say, hey, have you killed anyone this year? Could you let us know? And roughly a third of them respond with some information. Some of their shootings, maybe not all of them, the shootings of the bad guys, but like that other one, maybe we won't include that. And so you had this number that was purely a voluntary self-reported number by the police departments themselves without any independent oversight or any obligation to provide information. That included only about a third of these departments. And so we started reaching out, we trying to figure out, all right, someone must have done this. There must be a professor somewhere, there must be a journalist. And we figured that the guy who had the best count of fatal, there were two places that had the best count. There was a website literally called Killed by Police that was an Excel sheet list of every person they could find on the internet who'd been killed by the police. And then there was a true crime author in Las Vegas who was writing about police shootings and just wanted to figure it out, and so sent up a Google alert every day that sent him any information about new police shootings. So we're thinking, that seems kind of crazy. You know, we live in a society in the country where we count almost everything. We can tell you exactly how many people saw the movie Girls Trip at the movie theater downtown and how many of those people got popcorn, right? We know exactly, to the number. We know how many shark attacks there have been off of the coast of Los Angeles this summer. We know exactly how many acres have burned in wildfires this year, exactly how many homes were flooded in Houston. But we don't know how many taxpayers were shot and killed by bullets coming out of guns paid for by the taxpayers. No matter how you feel about the politics of policing and police shootings, that seemed like something that didn't really make any sense. And for us, especially being kind of, First Amendment transparency types, it made no sense at all. We thought we could march down to the Department of Justice and there would be a manila envelope for every police shooting. When it turned out, no one even had any idea of how many there were. But as we started talking to experts, to criminologists, to a few citizen journalists who had attempted to answer this question before, what we learned was that there was a good way to try to figure out the answer to this. You couldn't begin with public records requests and asking for documents. There were 19,000 departments, some of whom by law are not obligated to tell you anything about who they kill. In the state of Tennessee, no public agency has to respond to a records request unless it's from a Tennessee resident. Same's true in Arkansas. In many of these cases, Missouri is a state like this as well, large swaths of policing information are protected because they are technically personnel records. The city of St. Louis, for example, won't tell you if they fire a police officer. That is technically a personnel record, right? So So we knew we couldn't do it that way. This couldn't be a traditional journalistic effort where we send a bunch of records requests and then add the numbers all together and then no. But what we heard as we talked to folks who tried this before was that, especially if you're talking about shootings, not tasers or deaths in custody or deaths in jails, but shootings, that if someone is shot and killed by the police, whether it's in the largest media markets in the world, New York, LA, Boston, Chicago, or the smallest, Idaho and Wyoming, that one reporter at least one time writes it down once. That the local newspaper carries a brief that says there was an officer-involved shooting yesterday. That a local television reporter stands at the crime scene tape one time, even if it's at the 5 o'clock or the 7 o'clock a.m., and they say, I'm here at the scene of an officer-involved shooting last night. And so what we figured, and this was the genius of two of my colleagues, Julie Tate and Jennifer Jenkins, that if we did a series of coordinated Google searches every single day for killed by police and shot by police and officer-involved shooting and police shooting, that we could begin building an Excel sheet of every single police shooting that was reported in the media in the country in a given year. And that we could then use that as a tip sheet to go back to these departments and say, we heard you had a shooting yesterday. What can you tell us about it? And so we began doing that in a Google Doc. We began this spreadsheet where every day we would search these keywords, and every time we found a new one, we would place it in there, and we would begin going about the process of confirming all of the details. At first, we didn't even know what we were looking for. We knew we wanted name and race and armed or unarmed. We hadn't even begun the robust arguments about what the definition of unarmed and armed are. Is someone in a car driving at the police, according to the police, are they armed with a car or are they unarmed because there's no gun? Is someone gripping a broom handle at the moment they shot? Are they armed or are they unarmed? And different sets of people will tell you very different things, and they will feel very strongly about whether that person is armed or unarmed. So we began with just these few headers. And really the question we were going after was, how many? How often is this happening? We were thinking that, look, 463, if we could get to 500 shootings in a year, if we could find 50 shootings the feds had missed, this was going to be a major project, a major discovery. But as we get 1 month in, and 2 months in, and 3 months in, we started realizing we were going to have way more than 50 more. By the time we'd gotten to May, 5 months into the year, we had reached 500 fatal shootings that year, that had been individually confirmed by us. Ultimately, we ended up confirming 991 fatal shootings in the year 2015, more than double the amount the federal government had ever said had happened in any year. This occurrence, a fatal encounter between a police officer and a citizen, something we have been led to believe happened almost never, happens 2 to 3 times every single day in the United States of America. What we also began seeing were demographic trends and circumstantial and situational trends, right? The first thing we were looking at, besides the number, was how does this break down along racial lines? You know, we were shocked in raw number how many shootings were happening, and we were also shocked at how many white people were being shot and killed by the police. The majority of people killed by the police are white people. Now, the majority of people in the United States are also white people. But in raw number, we were talking about hundreds of people being shot and killed each year who often were not necessarily having their stories told either. But as we zeroed in on race, we did see that there were clear racial disparities in these breakdowns. And Black Americans represent 12 to 13% of the population, but we're 24% of the fatal shootings, and we're a full 40% of the unarmed people being shot and killed by the police. Especially in the unarmed demographic, the majority of police shootings in general are of men across the board. Not to say that there's not police violence against women, because there is. Of the unarmed people, the vast majority of those were men. The vast majority of the Black unarmed people were men. And so you're talking about a population that is 6% of the population that was making up 30 to 40% of the unarmed people killed by the police each year. Well, we also, beyond that, we saw some other things that were consistent. You know, the first was that there were a lot of people with guns who were being killed by the police. That one of the driving issues in police violence was that there are so many millions of firearms. But beyond that, we saw that mental illness was a major, major factor in these shootings. We saw this, it was popping up time and time again, where either the police or the family of the person who'd been killed said that mental illness was a factor. So we started searching for that specifically. And what we found was that in somewhere between a quarter to a half of these shootings, the person killed was in the midst of some type of mental or emotional health crisis. That you had people who, you had folks in the midst of mental health crises whose families were calling for help, and moments later the police were coming and killing the person. I think about that very often because part of why I think this data is important, why it's important to know these numbers, is so that we can begin looking at solutions and policies, right? Everyone wants to live in a world where the police don't kill people. The police would like to live in that world, and the rest of us would also like to live in that world. And I think about this very often because, again, we found that a quarter to a half of these shootings, hundreds of these shootings each year, are at least initially precipitated by some type of mental health crisis. And yet, the majority of our officers were not going through the type of crisis intervention training that teaches you the best practices of how to cope with these circumstances, that we are often sending men with guns into volatile situations where perhaps a man with a gun was not the thing that was going to solve the situation. If a quarter to a half of our police shootings began with someone being diabetic, we would give all of our officers insulin shots, right? We would very quickly say, oh, we could solve this problem. And yet, for whatever reason, in part because the aggregate data did not exist to definitively prove how often this was happening, so many of our officers were going to these situations unprepared to interact with the person they were interacting with. What we also found was that while we had been told over and over and over again that most officers never fire their weapons, are never involved in these shootings, which is probably true, that we were seeing a population of officers involved not in one shooting but in multiple shootings. Officers who, when they killed someone in 2015, this was their second fatal shooting on the job, or their third or their fourth. We had a husband and wife couple who each had 3 or 4 fatal shootings. We had sets of partners who had 3 or 4 fatal shootings each. We would have shootings where 6 officers would fire and each officer involved had previously killed 4 or 5 people. Now, in some of those cases, those were SWAT officers, snipers, people who might be brought in specifically volatile situations that might more often than not lead to you pulling the trigger. But in 50% of those cases, they were patrol officers, guys working a beat every single day, who over the course of a career, which for most people results in no shootings, had killed multiple people. Which reporting that raised additional questions about to what extent both officers after a shooting were being brought back onto the force, with what level of counseling and trauma training they were being given, but beyond that, about these early warning systems that many departments do have or should have that can flag an officer when their complaints begin to spike, when they start getting violations on small quality of performance things that can be indicative of an officer who might be about to commit a violent act. So we did all this reporting. We built this database. We still use this database. We still record these shootings in real time. We had 967 in 2016. We're on pace to be somewhere right between 960 and 990 this year. Still a pace of 2 to 3 fatal shootings a day. There was a great journalistic reception to that. We won a lot of awards, and people were happy that we were collecting this. In fact, many of the police groups who initially had told us that even counting this was anti-police. Why would you want to know how many people the police kill? You must hate police. Many of those groups, in fact, now use our data, because when you know who is killed and under what circumstances, you can begin to assess what your best practices might and should be to avoid shootings. But even as we were receiving some acclaim for this, one of the things that frustrated me, or that I continued to think about or come back to, and I still go back to, is those early conversations I had in Ferguson that first night. And I'd gone, over the course of these years, I've been in a lot of these cities, Ferguson and Baltimore and Milwaukee and Charlotte, Charleston, my hometown of Cleveland. But I remember those first people I interviewed on that first night in Ferguson and how they told me all of these stories and how at the end of the day I didn't really believe them. I'd let those stories stay in my notebook. I'd never written most of them. How I just couldn't quite believe that the police would really behave this way, that they were really acting this way. This must be embellished. This must be off. And then a few months after that, the Department of Justice report came out. And I read in that report these things that I had been told on the street earlier. that on the day Michael Brown was killed, there were more arrest warrants in Ferguson than there were residents because everyone had an arrest warrant for unpaid speeding tickets. That people were spending nights in jail for unpaid tickets. That the police were sicking dogs on people and beating up teenagers in parks. And I remember thinking to myself, well, first of all, I had a great story I didn't write. That was dumb. But second, what does it mean when even me, a young black reporter, shows up in your community and you tell me your story and I still don't quite believe you? And that would the people not have been better off had I believed them up front? That communities for decades, for centuries, have talked about how they are receiving disparate and disproportionate amounts of police violence and policing. They've talked about, and these communities remember, when you go to Milwaukee, they're not just talking about the police shooting that happened yesterday, they're talking about the one that happened in '67, and the one that happened in 2002, and then the one that happened in 2008. And yet, for so long, institutions and structures, the media being one of them, have chosen not to believe that this is true. Everyone must be making it up. Everyone must be exaggerating. That it shouldn't take 1,000 people in the street, or a gas station burned down, or a year-long effort by the Washington Post to decide that when a bunch of people tell you they are experiencing something, that you should spend the time and figure out that it's true. And so that's what I think about now in my day job now, is not just about these stories and how we tell them and the policies, but also about if there's a group of people, an oppressed group of people, a marginalized group of people, am I taking the time to both listen to them and then am I believing them? Because very often that's where that truth lies. I'm going to shut up and drink some water for a second, and then I would love to do some Q&A. Thank you, guys. So it looks like there are microphones on these two sides.
Thank you for being here. I have no question, but I will tell you this. Our new police chief is trying to incorporate a policy of having at least one social worker at each patrol station, because officers aren't trained to necessarily handle social problems. He knows that, he sees that, he's trying to make this work better for everybody.
And I think that's a really important point. As you talk to police chiefs, police trainers, rank and file officers, and to be clear, my book is largely about the activists who pop up in city after city, but I spend a lot of time talking to police as part of my job. And what they'll tell you is that the social ills of a nation have been placed largely on them to fix. That there is no number but 911 to call when your son is having a mental health crisis, when your daughter is having a mental health crisis, right? That our solution for both the obnoxious teenagers and the drunk guy and the drug dealer and the mental health crisis is to insert typically a man with a gun. And so I do think that there's an interesting conversation to be had about what is the role of police in our society, and should there be other social services that are readily available the way a police officer is, to be inserted in scenarios in which perhaps a man or a woman with a gun is likely to make it worse.
Hi. My question is more about something that you said. You mentioned the term media responsibility while you were talking, and I think that as an African-American student coming up here at UMKC, I have seen and met so many young African-Americans who have a thing for media, who are coming into journalism and they're going into mass media. And the thing that I feel like would make a huge difference is more of changing the narrative and controlling the narrative when the narratives are about us. I don't think we actively interact in news. In fact, we kind of avoid it. So as a young person in journalism who can give some advice to us as we create media, and I don't mean Huxtable, respectability, politics media, but real stories about real African Americans, what we're really like. People don't understand that the struggle is not over, that it hasn't ended. In fact, they see rap videos on BET and think that everyone's made it, and we should be, and if we're not making it, then we're thugs. There's so much in between that space. I mean, when you look at stories like the People of New York and stuff like that, we don't have that for African Americans. And I see so many talented journalists in this room just creating media every day. And I'm talking about Instagram and Snapchat. I'm talking about writing their stories, vlogging their videos, and doing great things. What tips can we take to create journalism that can be digested and understood to create a new narrative for ourselves?
Of course. Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, first of all, I think that it is important that Black Americans are creating and telling our own stories, right? These stories are going to be told. And if we opt out of telling these stories ourselves, we lose control of how they're told and who is telling them. Beyond that, I think that there needs to be an engagement with the mainstream media. I think it's a very good thing that we can now hear feedback from everyone immediately. And so when I show up in your town and get something wrong, you should blow my mentions up and tell me that. Because that is how, one, we correct the information and get it correct, but two, how we gain access to new sources, to new people. I might reach back out to you and say, hey, I didn't know. Can I ask you 7 more questions? Right? We need to, I think it's important for any group of people, but I think participation in the news process is how we guarantee a more accurate and fair news process. Beyond that, I do think it's important for there to be creation of news, and I think in creation of media and the telling of our own stories, whether that exists in social media, whether that's engagement with more mainstream media, participation in that. I mean, we have a major media diversity crisis in which our major newsrooms have never looked like the country, despite being charged with covering a diverse and complicated country. Very often our staff rosters are not very diverse or complicated. And I think that that is extremely important. When I drop into a Ferguson or a Baltimore at the time as a 23, 24-year-old Black kid, I was able to secure a different level of access, a different level of understanding from many of the young Black men and women stepping into the streets than one of my colleagues might have. And vice versa. There are people who, because of who I am and what I look like, are not answering my call or returning it, right? But who might for a different colleague. And so I think it's important, again, if we are going to cover a complex nation, we have to have that complexity reflected in our own staffs. Now, in order to do that, I think it's incumbent on us in the media to be supporting programs that are aimed at building a new generation of diverse writers and reporters and videographers. But it's also important that young men and women of color see this as a viable career path, as something they want to do and they should do, and something that is important. And so the biggest thing I'd say is that it is important. The way we are represented is determined by who is telling the stories. And if more of us are telling those stories, that representation starts to change. In terms of someone who might be interested in going into the media and going into writing, I think the most important thing to do is to start doing it. We have so many tools now that anyone can begin blogging, anyone can begin sending posts on social media, people can work for their campus papers or their campus television stations, because journalism and writing and interviewing are trades. They're not academic fields. They are things that when you do them, if you follow the recipe the first time, you'll get an okay enough thing. And by the 100th time, you'll be an expert at the thing. The sooner you start putting your reps in terms of writing and reporting and interviewing and feature writing, the better you will get at it. And so the sooner you start, the better off you're going to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I'd first like to thank you for coming out tonight. My question is, do you believe that the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening gave rise to Black consciousness or consciousness in America about how we as people hold the media accountable? Because, as you know, the Arab Awakening was in 2012, 2013, and then we see, the whole dynamic of propaganda or media relationships changing. And I was wondering if you believe that the North African Arab Spring had a little bit of an influence here in the United States.
I think the Arab Spring and the way the Arab Spring played out on social media particularly began to provide a roadmap for how social media could bend a democracy, and how it could, and how individuals could collectively use that platform to pressure the powers that be. I don't know that it mobilized or that it was a cause in that way. I mean, in terms of both media representation as well as just Black activism, I mean, there's a long history of one of the primary targets being media portrayal. But I do think that the Arab Spring was one of the moments that showed the power specifically of Twitter and how it could be leveraged, one, to provide information in spaces where the information otherwise was not being disseminated, two, to challenge official narratives that people maybe agreed or did not agree with. And so it's interesting. What I think is, and so I think there's certainly some influence, but I think is even more likely is that because that tool existed, most of the a lot of the young folks in the streets in Ferguson, Missouri had no idea what the Arab Spring was. Yet they made the same decision to use the same tools in the same way. And I think that speaks to the power of the tool, right? And so I certainly see deep similarities between those two narratives.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hi. Thank you for coming to our community, first of all. And I need to ask you before I ask my question, did you get any barbecue while you were here?
I've yet to have some barbecue, but the night is young, and so we can rectify that.
All right. What I wanted to ask you was, I'm struck by so many of these situations that happen with these shootings that get publicity, is that so often the strong reaction doesn't occur at the time of the shooting, but it's when there's a lack of justice involved. And my wife and I are both teachers, and we had a conversation one night. I thought you said something telling. When a teacher in a school harms a child, the teachers don't rally around and protect that colleague. What can we do? You say you talk to police officers a lot. What can we do to change that culture in the police where they rally around and protect each other in these terrible situations?
I think that there are two or three different things here. First, I'm not necessarily, very often I get questions that are about how do we create these conversations and make it so everyone understands everyone. And I'm kind of a pragmatist where I actually don't know that matters in a huge macro way. It doesn't really matter if we understand why we now don't do that bad thing. Let's just not do it, right? But that said, this is a specific space where I do think where relationships with leaders in the community can be vitally important. When we have silos in spaces where police officers are only talking to other police officers, it creates a culture that can be remarkably a circle your wagons type of culture. Beyond that, though, I also think there has to be engagement at a municipal level long before the critical incident about what the processes and policies are for what happens when you have an officer who either does something that they should not have or who you want to get rid of. One of the projects I'm working on this year is a project about asking the question of how difficult is it to get rid of a bad apple officer, right? Everyone, the spectrum of this conversation has been for a while folks who, on one far end, say police literally do nothing wrong, but then a few steps beyond that, where folks would say, look, there are bad apples just like in every profession. There are bad teachers, there are bad journalists, there are bad we're all humans. And then there are folks who would say there's a massive structural and systemic problem within policing that, in addition to there being some bad apples. So what we're asking is, all right, let's set the systems and structures aside for a second, even if we believe that is the case, and let's look at, if everyone agrees there are bad apple officers, can departments and chiefs get rid of them? Are they empowered to? Because if they cannot, then they have no incentive to even go down that road. They might as well retain the support of their colleagues in their rank and file. And what we found consistently, based on the way union contracts are written and the arbitration rules happen, and also based on how poor a lot of these departments are at HR, is that 60% of fired officers, the rare decision to fire an officer, 60% of those guys successfully appeal and get their jobs back. And so you have many cases, hundreds of cases, where a police chief does say, I don't want you to be a cop anymore, and then 6 months later has to eat it and give that guy his gun back. And so what we've seen is that because of the structures that our departments and our city councils and mayors are agreeing to very often in these collective bargaining agreements, what it means is that chiefs very often are not incentivized to get rid of bad officers, much less to blast them in the media or elsewhere, because those guys are coming right back. And so I think we have to have a conversation about, there was this assumption, I remember in 2014, if this officer did something wrong, he's going to get punished. Why don't we just let it all play out? Why is everyone so mad right now? Why can't they wait for what we now know? And we know this, it's not, conjecture. We know this statistically. Police officers are not charged when they shoot and kill people. And when they are charged, they are not convicted of those crimes. Police officers are rarely fired. And when they are fired, they very often successfully get their jobs back. And so I think we have to address those. I think that part of the structure inhibits the culture, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for coming. I'm sitting up here, I don't really know how to put it, but I know that there's a lot of exploitation as far as the justice system with the police and brutality. but have you ever thought about exploiting the juvenile system and the justice system? Because like over here, they're killing one or two, and not to make it any less credited, but you have 7,000 juveniles in jail right now for like lengthy sentences over 50 years for minor crimes, not even as much as, assault. And my son is one of them. That's why I've been reading a lot about it. He he actually was arrested because I called the police because he ran away. He ran to Texas. He had my mother's weapon on him. They didn't search his property. They searched him. He'd never been to jail, had no history or any background of anything. He was 16. He was sent to the juvenile system. They actually, when he got in there, he shot the glass out, tried to break through the glass and escape. He had 36 stitches in his arm. They requested 99 years in jail. Yeah. They gave him 50. So I'm really struggling with trying to figure out why is this not exploited? Because it's kind of like a smoke screen, like the president attacking the football. You got this going on over here. You do have few blacks or other minorities being killed, and not to less credit it, but you have 7,000 children who could have opportunity that are taken and rounded up like cattle, never to be seen again. So I don't know. Maybe we should exploit other things as well, because again, behind screens, you have other people who are being collected and you can save these lives because they're not gone.
I think that first of all, thank you for sharing that with me. And I do think it's important. I think that what becomes, with the juvenile justice system specifically, and I've got some colleagues who've done some great work on this in both at my paper as well as other places, and I do think it's a major point where we should be applying pressure, in part because in the juvenile justice system there's even less access to information and records, because a lot of these the specifics very often are not playing out in open court or in public records, because very often this is happening in juvenile courts. It's much more difficult to get a hold of this data in aggregate or even the information about what happens in an individual case, and so it's important that pressure is applied, and as we have incarcerated so many tens and hundreds of thousands of people, I do think we have to focus and look at the extent to which that has happened, specifically in our juvenile systems, and in addition to scenarios like what you described, specifically with the post-Columbine creation of the school resource officer, in which we now have police officers mediating school behavior issues in schools. And so you have kids who are getting assault charges for getting in fights in their school hallways that in the past would have gotten them like smacked with a ruler. And that is creating, I mean, they call the school to prison pipeline, creating a pipeline of folks who otherwise would be dealt with school discipline, who are in fact getting charged with crimes as juveniles, and how that is creating a pipeline to a bigger and broader justice system. And so I think there's a ton there. The Miami Herald just did a great project that's published last week, specifically about the juvenile prisons in Florida, and about how many of the guards were essentially setting up fight clubs and having these kids fight each other. We've seen great reporting from my friends at the Baltimore Sun on their school resource officers and their juvenile court system and how unjust that can be. And so I think there's a ton. You know, what's unfortunate in this space is that there's a million strings to pull on of what I think equal importance, because I think they are all very important. And unfortunately, not enough resource and not enough people pulling on those strings. And so, but I really appreciate you saying that, and that, you know, only underscores the urgency for me to make sure we are looking at stuff like that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, I thought it was a really good lecture. Thanks for coming out. I had to go to the bathroom the whole time, but I held it till the end. So let me know if someone already asked this question, because I just got back fairly recently. So you mentioned it near the end that all these people in Ferguson had told you there's these stories about what had been happening to them for decades, if not, a very long time, but you didn't believe them, even though it came out later that these things were true. And then there's all these other instances in our lives where people tell us all these systemic horrible problems that are happening to them in their communities, but we don't believe them. And, like you said, people might not pull on those threads until these things are too far gone. So why do you think that we don't believe people even when they're telling the truth.
Part of it is, yeah, well, I think that's a good question, and I agree with whoever just said that. I mean, part of it's that we do not want to believe that the world is as it is. Very often especially, and frankly, because especially when we're talking about systems and when we're talking about inequities, these systems don't address or affect all of us in the same ways. There are people who cannot fathom a police officer shooting them in the back at a traffic stop because it probably would not happen to them. It is, in fact, unfathomable, right? And so because of that, when someone who they don't know, who doesn't look or sound like them, explains that this thing has happened, it doesn't register with their lived experience. I think we are very, and part of this is because it's my job to go different places and talk to people who aren't like me at all and try to understand their lived experiences. I think we collectively as a society do a very poor job of empathizing and understanding that everyone's experience is not our own experience and that other people have different lived experiences. We saw this. I mean, I get this question all the time when I speak, especially with majority white audiences, where people say, why did the police start killing all these people in 2014? Why is this issue getting so much worse? And what I say is, we don't have historic data on police shootings. We don't know how many people were killed in 92 or 2002 or 2012. I would guess that 2015 might actually have been a low year. Right? I don't have any reason to believe the police in the 1960s were killing fewer people than they were killing them.
Graphs like violence has been going down,
especially as violence has gone. Well, and the invent of things like tasers and where there are other tools. Mm-hmm. But the reason people ask that, and the reason they ask that is because they just began seeing these videos all the time. That they did not believe this was happening until they could see it with their own eyes. I think that does say something about who we are as a people, not the best thing about who we are as a people, but that it took literal cell phone evidence of these things happening for a lot of people to admit that they must be happening, even though generations of folks had said so. Like I said, I think that some of that is malice, some of that is willful ignorance and naivete, and a lot of it is this because my life is not this way, it must not be this way. And I think that transcends a lot of especially when you're talking about either oppressed or otherwise marginalized groups of people. We see this with LGBT folks. We see this with the conversation we're having about sexual assault, both on campus and elsewhere, right? If it couldn't happen to me, then it must not be happening. I mean, I never was assaulted on my college campus, so there must not be a culture of this, right? Without accepting the reality is that I might be much less likely to have been assaulted on my campus based on who I am and how the society interacts with us. And so I think more of us having more conversations and more honest coverage about what is happening in people's lives will help us be better at understanding that our experiences may not be universal.
Mm-hmm.
We're about 28 days into the renewed protests for the acquittal of Jason Stockley. And Bruce Franks said recently that they've learned a lot and that they are ready to protest for even longer. And so I was wondering, as you went around the country and reported on different movements, what are your insights and observations on the growing young people's organizations and also how they are going to sustain, and it's even snowballing now, for the future?
I think that that's a good question. I appreciate it. And it's been remarkable that there has been sustained protest for as long as there has been following the acquittal of Jason Stockley in St. Louis again. One of the primary lessons is that, when Ferguson initially happened and later Baltimore and many of these other cities, folks in the media, folks in some organizations desired a singular charismatic leader. We wanted to know who called the protest. Are the churches behind this? Was this really the NAACP? Was it what national are the unions bankrolling this? This must be some type of deep structured thing. And even as many of the young activists began identifying themselves and began devoting their time to this work, we spent an inordinate amount of time attempting to anoint people leaders or not. There was the amount of time and energy and ink devoted to debates over who was a founder of this or who started this or who did that. It was just endless. Not that there's not a real legitimate conversation to be had about who deserves credit and who does not. What I think one of the lessons from many of the places I've been has been that the places that see any change in the short term, and so therefore the opportunity for any change in the long term, are places where there really is a robust grassroots desire and energy for that change. Because when the cameras leave and when all of us who got on airplanes and get back on the airplanes and go away, including those support systems, including the union officials and the national activists, there becomes a question of who's going to be here on day 122, who's going to be here on day 322, who's going to be here on anniversary 4 of this shooting in this neighborhood, who's still going to be demanding of the new police chief when folks change out, of the new council members. And so it's unsurprising to me in St. Louis, for example, that there is a sustained energy, in part because there were a lot of local people who were there. That while there were folks who came in from all over the place, there was a core of activist energy that was St. Louis, and it was from St. Louis. And so it's unsurprising to me that has stayed and sustained. Places that have had less success at sustaining that energy have certainly been in my mind, have been some places that never had the same type of strength at the core. Even places that have had, Cleveland and North Charleston would be good examples. Places that have had among the most emotional and gripping videos and shootings and stories, but that the grassroots energy perhaps was not there initially. And so I think that's been a big delineation between what places have seen longer term success and which places have not.
In terms of, so we have that activism, or we don't have to really worry on anniversary 4 or 5 who's carrying out the activism. From a policy perspective, what do you feel is the best organization that's advocating for this, but maybe not only, what's the best route? Is it federal? Is it state? When the federal government doesn't even know how many police systems we have in this country, I don't think that might be the best route. So paying attention to our local state reps, paying attention to local, maybe city elections, has there been any work and thought going into putting systems in place and putting things in check?
So there's been a lot of work these last few years done specifically aimed at district attorneys. Within a criminal justice system, the prosecutor has some of the most power of anyone. They can choose just not to charge you for that thing the cops picked you up for that was nonsense, right? They can choose not to seek a felony charge instead of a misdemeanor. They can choose to give you community service, right? The highest number of subjective decisions are happening at that point. And that is a person who is elected almost always, which means there's an electoral or a political pressure point there, as opposed to the individual line officer who, if they are going to arrest you, they are going to arrest you, right? We've seen a lot of work done in those spaces. Color of Change has done a ton of that work, specifically trying to mobilize voters around district attorney elections, as well as to shift a narrative. I mean, we've had a tough on crime narrative in our politics for a very long time, and that shift. I do think at the federal level the data collection element is extremely important. We've seen groups like the Center for Policing Equity do a lot of work with that, trying to collect and disseminate that type of data and then analyze it. Going into a department that wants to open its books because they want to know, and then running every test and running the number every way, and then being able to show those results to other departments is as a means of helping that individual department change. I do think, though, and part of it's because of the project I'm working on this year, I do think so much of it is at the municipal level and specifically at the municipal contract level. Every 2 to 3 years, city councils and county councils are agreeing to collective bargaining agreements with these police departments. And for decades, these police unions have backloaded all types of provisions into these contracts, often because the cities cannot provide their officers raises, and so they're willing to give them basically anything else they want. And once something goes into a contract, it almost never comes back out. And so you have provisions like the 48-hour rule where where theoretically an officer's memory of an incident will be best after 2 REM sleep cycles, and so they don't have to give a statement for 2 days after they kill somebody. Or in some cases, that's 7 days. Baltimore, it's 7 days. Or there are departments that at the end of every year have to purge any information that would be embarrassing to an officer from that officer's personnel file. There are provisions, extensive provisions in many departments about not just progressive discipline, but about the idea that each individual action must be considered only in a vacuum in and of itself. We did a piece on an officer earlier this year who had been fired for arresting people and then pulling over on the side of the road, taking their handcuffs off and saying, "You can fight me for your freedom." And they had fired him for this once, and he had got his job back. And then they got him on tape doing it again. And when they fired him, the arbitrator ruled that you could not fire him because you had to treat this as a first offense, and it would be unfair to fire him on the first offense, even though he had literally been fired for this exact same reason. All of these things get backloaded into union contracts. Union contracts that are voted on by city council members, that are ratified by mayors and signed off by county councils. And so at that level, and very often without the robust knowledge, this is on the local media as well. Very often we cover union contracts about whether or not you're getting a raise. We don't talk at all about anything else in that contract. I remember, and then I'll shut up, when Sam DuBose got killed by a University of Cincinnati police officer in 2015. The district attorney at the time, old Hamilton County, Ohio Republican, had been around forever, decades. But he saw the body camera video and he thought this was a murder. This guy should not be dead. I'm charging this guy. First time he'd ever charged a police officer in his jurisdiction, like 30 years. And he goes to give this press conference, and he's completely flustered, and he goes, and there's some BS rule where I couldn't even interview this guy for 2 days. I didn't even know what happened. The guy had been the district attorney for decades and was unaware about these things being backloaded in these police union contracts. So I think and there are some, Campaign Zero does some work on that. There are some organizations that have looked at that. I really do think that's an area where local sunshine, both in the press as well as local pressure from activists, could create a playing field and a system that is more inclined towards equity and justice, because perhaps it's stripped of some of these provisions that the public, one, doesn't know about, and two, might not agree with. Thank you. All right. Thank you all.